This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
The Rose Bowl. The game that inspired the college football bowl season has a long and storied history. The stadium itself is 100 years old, and in celebration of it, Pigskin Dispatch is assembling some of the top historians and authors to share the memories, people, and events that make the granddaddy of them all the special game that it is. Enjoy this Rose Bowl memory from pigskindispatch.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of pigskindispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And it is Rose Bowl month, and we are celebrating all month the great game that's coming up here in early January, and talking about the history of the first almost 20 years of the game. And we're sharing it tonight with historian Timothy Brown of Football Archaeology. Tim, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Hey, Darren, thank you. Look forward to chatting. This one is near and dear to my heart. The first book I wrote was about the World War I Rose Bowl games. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the puzzle to this one.
Well, why don't we should have did this in the first episode when you kicked it off and you mentioned the book, and I apologize for not doing so, but why don't you give us the name of that book, and if it's still available, where people can get it?
Called Fields of Friendly Strife. So kind of modeled off of the Douglas MacArthur phrase, but it's available on Amazon. So either paperback book, or if you subscribe to Kindle Unlimited, you can get it for free. Okay,
very good. So definitely a lot of the information we're going to talk about tonight, because we're going to talk a little bit of military football and its association with the Rose Bowl. So this is some exciting games we're going to be talking about. So I can't wait to hear about this history.
Yeah, I guess so. One of the things that is just fascinating to me is just we assume that football is either professional or associated with schools, but early on there was a decent chance that the military could have been and stayed involved in football and other sports, because they were for a long time, and there were some a lot of games really from almost the start of football through into the 1960s. The military bases and naval ships, etc., played a lot of played football games, for both recreation and just for the physical fitness and etc. of the troops or sailors or Marines. But so what happened, however, was that in they were planning to have a 1918 Rose Bowl game, but this thing called World War I kind of got in the way. And so in October or so of 1917, the Rose Bowl committee reached out to Woodrow Wilson and said, hey, is it going to be okay for us to play this game that it involves likely bringing some team from the East Coast, and travel was restricted, and there are all kinds of concerns about that. And Wilson, who had been the manager of the Princeton team when he was an undergrad and had also coached when he was at, forget if it was Williams or Amherst, but one of the two. So he's one of the 4 football coaches who became U.S. presidents. So he was a big football supporter, and he ended up, he said, yeah, have the game. It's important that we continue with these kinds of, contests, for the spirit of the nation. So then they were looking at, military teams from the East Coast and military teams from the West Coast. So instead of, they were looking at colleges too, but, pretty much the colleges were fairly early on were saying, we can't play, we're not, we can't send our students out there with travel restrictions, etc. So they started looking for military military competitors, and there was a group out in Allentown, Pennsylvania, an ambulance corps team that had a pretty good record. And there were a couple of others out there, and even I think Pitt was under consideration. But one way or another, different teams kind of got picked off. The ones they were thinking about coming from out east got picked off, and so there really wasn't anybody worth bringing out. So they ended up deciding to go with, they had already decided they were going to use the Mare Island Marines. Mare Island is in San Francisco Bay Area, and that was the training facility for Marine recruits, into say 1924 or so. So they had a heck of a team, and they had played a schedule that included college teams from the West Coast as well as some military teams. And in fact, they had played a team called Camp Lewis during the season and had beaten them. Camp Lewis was up in just outside of Tacoma, Washington, and it was a big 31,000 soldier training camp for the 91st Division, whereas Mare Island only had 2,600 recruits. And as it turned out, kind of one thing led to another, and Mare Island was invited. They were waiting to see who they're going to play, and Camp Lewis kind of went on a tear towards the end of the season, won the rest of their games, and so they were invited to meet Mare Island. So he ended up with an Army versus Marine game for 1918.
Well, that Camp Lewis probably wanted to get a little bit of the respect back after getting beat by Mare Island earlier in the season, when you think.
Yeah. And well, the funny thing, both teams had a bunch of guys from the Northwest. There were 9 players from the University of Oregon spread across the two teams. There were a couple of guys from, I think there are 2 guys from Minnesota, but a couple of guys from Cal and Stanford, Washington, etc. So because Camp Lewis was in the Northwest, and the Army, if you got drafted, you went to a training camp either in your state or a neighboring state, whereas the Marines, they had people from anywhere west of the Mississippi. But they still had mostly guys from, at least from a football standpoint, guys from the Northwest. So these two teams knew one another. A bunch of them were teammates, with guys on the opposing teams. They had, in fact, the Marines because a bunch of them had played at Oregon, they got the Oregon coach to come and coach them for the Rose Bowl. A guy named Bezdek, who, ended up having a great career, ended up, he was at Penn State, he had been at Arkansas, etc. So, anyways, it's just, it's still this East-West game, lots of national attention, lots of folks interested in the game. Anybody who had a Marine as a family member or a soldier as a family member, was all, getting into this game. So they finally meet on New Year's Day, and Mare Island led at half, 9-7, and then so it's pretty tight game in the first half, but then Mare Island just kind of took it to them, and they only won 19-7, but it was very clear who the better team was. They had beaten them early or during the season, and then they beat them after the season as well. So. But one of the neat things, and I'll hold off on covering this too much, but it's not so much neat, but one of the interesting things is that a lot of these guys who played in the 1918 game, they were finishing their training, and then they were getting sent over either for additional training or sent overseas, sent to France and the Netherlands. So, I'll maybe after we talk about the 1919 game, I'll kind of talk about kind of what happened to some of these guys. But there were a bunch of these, I think like 14 of the 20 guys or 18 guys on the Camp Lewis roster, ended up in France, and they saw, fair amount of battle, etc. So it was a very bittersweet thing for these guys too. A lot of them figured, okay, this is the last time I'm ever going to play football, and they had no idea how long the war is going to last. So it was, anyways, I'll kind of hold off on that for a minute, but because I think the implications of both of these teams are really pretty interesting. Any questions about
no. So
I sit here and I start jabbering, and so
Mare Island showed their dominance earlier in the season. Played at Camp Lewis, played again in the Rose Bowl, overcame a close game at halftime and won 19-7. They're the Rose Bowl winners of 1918 Rose Bowl. So yeah. So okay, very, very interesting. So the war is still going on the following year. So I guess that sort of segues us into talking about the 1919 season.
Yeah. Well, so it's the 1918 season, 1919 Rose Bowl.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry.
But I mean, I get those. Well,
I'm going to break in right here for just a second, because this is a great way to segue into the next part. But we're going to wait a couple of days and come back to Tim Brown of footballarchaeology.com, and he'll talk about that next season, the season of 1918 and the 1919 Rose Bowl. And tomorrow we have another guest that's going to be talking about that in between these two segments of Tim's. So we're going to get a lot of coverage on this 1918 season of both teams and the Rose Bowl game played on 1919, January 1st.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.